Okay, morning everyone. Thank you for coming to Policy Exchange. This is a major event for us here at Policy Exchange and the Crime and Justice team. This is the first one we've held this year. And a lot of our work, as many of you know, will always be about looking at innovation and best practice from the international world. And so this is a particularly important event for us where those two things come together. A few words from me at the beginning. If you are on Twitter and are following the event, then it's #Predictive Policing. We are very lucky to be joined by guests from the United States and from the UK to discuss this theme. I'm not chairing. We're lucky to have Roger Grafe, the renowned filmmaker and criminologist, here to chair the event. So I'll shortly hand over to him, but just to say there will be a slight break at 1 o'clock. If people haven't had sandwiches by then, they can grab sandwiches, or if people need to slip away, that's fine. And then we'll have, after the presentation, the break, a response from Nick Gardner. But thank you for coming to the event.
Thanks, and welcome to everybody. I'm particularly Sean and George, and it's on a way to discuss what, for me, as a criminologist, is really, really interesting. Because over the years that I've been involved in police, which is essentially now, dare I say, maybe even a bit more, I've been interested in the gap between environmental criminology and the police, the normal criminology dealing with firefighting police, reactive policing, and so on. And as I travelled between these two worlds, I kept saying, you know, there's some really interesting stuff in crime pattern analysis that you guys were interested in, repeat offending patterns and so on. And slowly but surely, conventional policing seems to absorb some of those lessons. Hotspot policing started in Northumbria here in the 90s. But I remember saying to a commissioner, assistant commissioner at the Met, look, I don't understand why people are more interested in numbers and patterns and this kind of thing. And he said, well, we're starting to use numbers. He said, but we still use our gut feeling about the numbers. You can't give up the attachment to our gut feeling yet. And it has taken a while. But one of the things I'm hoping to hear from Sean and George, particularly Sean, is how the gut feeling squares with the kind of complexity and forensic refinement, if you like, of this technique. So that's enough for me. Sean.
Okay. Thank you. Make sure I'm not. Okay, how's that? Good? Well, first of all, I'm Sean Malachowski. I'm not Charlie Beck, as I hear, but it's always good to put the boss up there, don't you think? Charlie Beck, I'm not nearly as tall or handsome as Charlie Beck, but I work for him and he's let me do a lot of interesting things that I think are going to affect crime. So let me run through this first. This is an article, and I know that some people have read this article. I think, yeah, this is an article that came out maybe in 2008. It's Chief Beck, when we were talking back to the years when we had Chief Bratton as our chief, we had been talking about just this issue that you bring up about, you know, can we do a better job? Now the numbers are pretty good. We had, for the first time, clean data and a volume of data that we could rely on, and how can we leverage that to do a better job in crime reduction? And then this article is just kind of our current chief talking to the police community about, let's get smart about it, like some of the retailers are in terms of using data to improve profits. Our bottom line being fewer victims rather than dollars. So the question we kept asking is, what if you could stop a crime before it happens? And you know, that seemed like kind of science fiction-y a few years ago. But we're finding, and through the work that I've done with my colleague George Tita at UC Irvine and with some of our colleagues at UCLA, we're starting to see that, in fact, over the last few years in a computer modeling environment, that we can predict with some accuracy and account for about 70% of the crime through these forecasts that they are able to produce. So we got it to a point where we thought, let's make it actionable. And there are a couple of things that I'd like to put up this definition, because predictive policing as a term, we started using that term a couple of years ago, and it kind of took off in the US, at least with some of the funding agencies, and the media picked up on it. I don't know, it's the alliteration maybe of predictive policing they found attractive, but this kind of stuck, and it's created a problem for us sometimes, because they think it's like that Minority Report, where we're arresting someone before they commit a crime. And in fact, this is not an individual-based strategy at all. We're not taking data about individuals, we're not profiling individuals. It's not an arrest-based strategy either, which is another argument that people are concerned about. Are we going into areas that we've somehow labeled as bad areas and arresting everyone we see in those areas? And that's certainly not what we're doing. I believe that if we're making an arrest, we're wasting our time. You know, we can't arrest our way out of this volume of crime. So I wouldn't like to have a police officer down in the station for 3 or 4 hours booking a burglary suspect who's going to be out in 3 days when he could be out there preventing burglary. And the officers don't want that either. I don't think it serves anybody's purpose. So the idea here is to get out and to disrupt that activity based on the risk. So it doesn't make sense with scarce resources to patrol randomly. It doesn't make sense to patrol 100% evenly, so that areas that are not having any crime occur, or don't have the potential for crime occur, are being policed in the same way that areas that have a high potential. So it just makes sense to us. It builds on hotspots policing, which we did rip off from you some years ago. But we think that this offers more specificity even, because if you look at this, what we consider state-of-the-art, we're looking at a 7-day map of crime, or a 28-day map of crime. And then kind of in our heads, in a meeting that takes 10 minutes in the morning, we're saying, all right, it looks like we're having a burglary from motor vehicle problem. Let's deploy officers over there during these watches. And, you know, it's this gut feeling, a lot of gut feeling. It always made me nervous that we were using gut so much. So what happened then, when we got to this, we're getting very specific into a 500 by 500 foot box. And there's 20 of them distributed over a 50 square mile area. So you'll see when George is talking about the methodology, how small that is. Very specific target. But what happened is when we started to implement, I had to have a gut check of my own, because I'm the one who's on the line. You know, I'm the commanding officer of this division that is giving out the missions every day for the last 6 months, and then through my own doing, I'm going to give that up to the computer the next day. It was a little sleepless night, you know, but it's working out. So how is this different? And I apologize for all the text. I just didn't want to miss something. So this is evidence-based rather than kind of a common sense approach that I described to you before on that 7-day map. This is forecasting instead of what we're very good at now, which is looking at crime retrospectively at CompStat. This is reducing our tendency to chase the dots, which is the problem that you have in looking at a retrospective crime map, is that you're, especially as crime is being driven down, because what I've noticed is we have our crime week briefing every morning. If there's anything, 3 dots anywhere near each other, people are jumping on that, you know. And I think what happens is you're just chasing dots. And so the algorithm really helps us sort out over a long period of time, 3 years of data is what we use. Helps us to sort out what are meaningful patterns and what is just background noise and that kind of thing, which you could not really do effectively yourself. And so this is chasing dots, yeah, little graphic there. And then it offers more specificity in time and space, and that's a box. That's the red box that we use on these maps, and that's why you'll see me in the hallway talking to the officers saying, "Are you getting in the boxes? Did you get in the box? What are you doing in the box?" And I keep talking about it, and that's where that comes from. And the other thing I like about the strategy is it should eliminate some biases. You know, we're not using arrest, and also everybody has filters and screens when they're putting out these missions that are going to affect their decision making, and the computer doesn't have that restriction. And it leverages the real-time data that we already have. I wanted to make the point that this is not a massive multivariate approach, and there are some of those approaches, and I think they are valid in certain circumstances. But you really need to be sure that your data is 100% accurate and that you know the relationship between that factor and crime and how it's weighted versus the other factors, and what if you miss one, and you know, there are some issues with that, I think. And it's fine when it's working, but then when it stops working, do we know why that is, you know, and can we easily get in there? So what we're using is very simple. It's just the crime, just reported crime going back in time, and it's date, time, location, and the type of crime that goes through the algorithm. And what we're doing is we allow the officers to get in there at the right place at the right time. They get in the box, and the way we got buy-in from them essentially was, we're not taking their decision-making away. I'm just giving them better info as to where to be. So it's not that different from what they were seeing. They used to get a mission map that had a little larger area and some more information about what to look for. But once they get in there, I ask them to look around in that 500 by 500 foot box and do some problem solving. You know, look at why is this box a high probability box? And it's readily apparent to them. You know, I went out with some officers and we were in the box, and it's adjacent to one of our projects, and there's no parking in there, so the whole street is packed, both sides of the street, and in the alleys and everything with cars available to break into. And so I bring them in there, I say, so what do we see here? And there's glass on the street. I said, this is why we're here, it's burglary from motor vehicle problem. So let's find out when it's happening, and then they dig in a little bit, and they can do better problem solving. The other thing, and I think when George talks, I'll have him talk, if you would, about the dosage. This is something that we're doing. We have, for the first time really in LAPD, doing a controlled randomized study where certain days the command officers are putting the missions out, developing the missions, and on other random days, a treatment where the computer is doing it. And that allows us to then assess at the end which is more effective, and we're tracking that. But this idea of dosage, we're also having the officers account for when they're in the box. They can change their status on the computer, and the clock starts running, how long they're in each box. And then we compile that at the end of the week, and we'll compare that to their whole radio output for that day, and we'll see what the dosage is. Because what we're finding is we can come up with great missions, but if we don't know if they're delivering on the missions, then how do we know that it worked, right? So we're trying to measure how much time they're spending in the boxes. And this is complicated by the fact that we don't have GPS right now on the cars, but we should in a few months. So we're looking forward to that. All right, so the questions to be answered. So the main question, is it possible to predict crime? We think so, and that was based on a couple of years. I mean, we've been working together for somewhere between seven years with UCLA since I started going there, and really been modeling this for the last 4 years or so, and we think, yes, there's the possibility of forecasting or predicting crime, where it will occur. And if we predict it, can we prevent it? That's what we're doing this initial test, this 6-month test in Foothill to determine is, if we have this good actual information, can we get the cops out there and can they prevent a crime from occurring? And we'll give you some results on that. And if we prevent it, how can we measure that? And I'm going to ask George to talk more about that, but that's really through this randomized control study. And by the way, it's an exciting prospect that we could roll this out through all 21 divisions and do a 6-month test. What I'm trying to hold the line on right now, because you know how the police department is, they're like, okay, does it work? You know, the 2 days after I started, and I'm like, I don't know. So 6 months in, we'll have that first test, and I know they're going to want to go then. They're like, okay, it works, roll it out. And what we're going to require, and I got to make sure that this works, is every division that gets the tool is going to have to do a 6-month randomized control study of whether it's working. And the reason for that is I'd like to have the data, but also it will convince that commanding officer who may not be as convinced as I am, because I had a little crisis of faith in the beginning, you know, when I was handing over. So it'll convince them, if they can see that 6 months of data and see that it is actually affecting their bottom line, then I believe they'll hold on to it.
Sean, can I just interrupt you one second? When that example you gave, taking the guy out into the box, there's the broken glass, all the cars, what does success look like to you in a situation like that?
Well, you know what I think success looks like is if we go back and we look at our crime numbers for that week, and instead of having 10 or 12 burglaries from motor vehicle, if that's come down to 8, you know. Okay. So we have fewer victims. That's what the bottom line is for me. And however they get there, you know, it could just be their presence on the most basic level, that they're in there and they're talking to somebody about, hey, you know what, you should lock your car up or take that stuff out of your car. And then here comes Knucklehead who's going to break into the car, and the police are there. And it disrupts his activity, and he's like, you know, it's too hot out here today, I'm not going to do my activity. Or they figure out a way to get some of those street cars off the street or relight the street or any number of other problem-solving techniques. And what I find is the officers were kind of I think they were getting frustrated with our current system, and this kind of reinvigorated them. There's some test effects from that, I'm sure, where it's just the fact that they're being studied.
That's true, but all I was going to say is that in order to get cars off the street or improve the lighting, you have to go through the city council.
Yes.
And that takes a long time, and do the ordinary officers have the authority to do that? I just want to tease that one out.
Sure. Well, you know what the officers can do, and they're pretty skilled at this, is they get with our senior lead officers who are responsible for that type of thing, and they'll hand that off as a project to them. And you're right, I think it would be a longer-term solution. Some of those things take months or a year to happen. But just the focused attention on that, I think is on the most basic level what's going to disrupt the criminal activity from occurring. And the other compound effects, we were talking about this earlier, is that you don't have the officers tied up in the station making arrests and filling out reports because you're having fewer crimes occur, which allows you to be out in the field more often, which allows you to have fewer crimes. So there should be, over time, a cumulative effect. So those are the three questions. This is this is just basically the model of how we do the predictive modeling. We get some kind of visualization tool. We send it out either via video or, in this case, on printed maps. They design the intervention. This is the dosage. How many officers are we going to send? And really, this reminds me to talk about dosage. When we have a crime problem sometimes in the city of LA, they'll send so many officers, 20 officers in a task force to tamp down this particular crime, and it works. Nothing moves when they're in there. But when they leave, it comes back. There's other side effects. People feel like they're living in a police state. So we, up to this point, to this study, we've had no information on what the proper dosage is. So how long does a police officer have to be in there to be safe and also to be effective? So we're just starting that dosage. And once we get the vehicles with the GPS on it, I think we'll make great strides in that area. But we're starting to look at that. There's also this idea of pushing the GIS, pushing the stuff to the car so that they're only getting just-in-time information. One problem we're fighting at LAP is there's too much information now. They have too much data. These officers are totally overburdened. They're going to watch 30 slides in roll call and remember one of them. So we'd like to get them the information as they're driving through an area at a time they need it. So we're working on that. And then the data that they collect while they're out there, we're working on a way to get that back into the analysis. So that's just an overall model. And then this, I think, where I'm ending, there's a big issue I heard people talk about earlier, is how do you get the officers to buy in? And this is one of my biggest fears in rolling this out to other divisions is, I don't know if you can tell, but I'm pretty much a zealot on this stuff. I believe it's going to work. And that comes across to the officers. And when the captain is into it, and they like the captain, and he cooks them Thanksgiving dinner and stuff, then they're going to do it. But what if you got a guy who's like, I don't know, Malinowski came up with these maps, go out there and see what happens then, So we're going to give a couple of series of seminars to teach people to be creative and put things out. They got this when we started. It's a little one-pager. The officers want to know what the rationale is. And I think you just be honest with them and say, hey, I appreciate you taking a leap of faith and doing it. And this kind of explained to them why we were doing it and why it's important that they get out there and use their knowledge, skills, and experience to when they get in the box. So, and then when it was working, we started sending, follow-ups, get in the box, and then it turned into a whole thing in the station where people couldn't wait to tell me that they arrested someone in the box. And I had to say, remember I said it's not about arrest? I don't want you dragging someone back into the box to make like, did it happen in the box or did you drag him back? So. And at this point, I was going to suggest that my colleague, Dr. Tita, come up from UCI and talk through some of the methodology that has been used.
So if you maybe answer your question, sorry, why did you choose Foothill? Did you want to speak to that?
Because Sean was the
I was the CO.
That's why.
And it was perfectly suited to the model. It was really because we needed, the most important factor we thought in the first test was that buy-in from the officers, and I knew I could get it done there.
So how do I?
It's the, yeah, that one.
Okay. Well, first off, it's a great pleasure to be here. And already, I don't know if I'll ever be able to talk about this without stealing Graham's, forensic refinement, because I think this is exactly what this boils down to. Predictive policing is not a new policing paradigm. It's not magic. It's not hocus pocus. It's forensic refinement. It is a better way to allocate scarce resources. And as I like to say, after a decade or more of crime reduction in Los Angeles and in the United States, the low-hanging fruit has been plucked. The goal, unless people start bringing back items that were stolen in the last 5 years, crime isn't going to go negative. So we can't have 5%, 5%, 5%. We have command staff at LAPD that believe that if we drop crime 5% last year, we better do it this year. At some point, we're just going to have to accept that there's a bottom, and we're not going to go beyond that. And I really think it's going to be difficult to maintain staying at that bottom. And that is where such forensic refinement as predictive policing, I think, really can play an important role. So, what am I doing up there? I'm working with Jeff Rantingham, who's actually an anthropologist and studies hunting and gathering societies, which is very important. George Moeller was a postdoc at UCLA in the Department of Mathematics, and he's now at Santa Clara University, that refined the algorithm that we're using, and there's me. But I think why it's so important that one might say, an anthropologist studies foraging behavior. What does that have to do with crime? And the answer is, I think it's obvious. It has everything to do with crime. Because we don't just have this black box algorithm that if you just feed a lot of data on, it just so happens to spit out some pretty good answers. It's based upon some principles that I think make sound social science, or based upon sound social science theory and what we know about human behavior. And for that matter, the behavior of all species. And that is foraging behavior. And that is that behaviors and patterns of movement through one's environment are predictable and not random. That there are bounds to where a species will forage for some particular resource. Take that resource away, and maybe the species moves on, or maybe that species becomes extinct. And we're arguing that it's the same thing with the criminal. That if you can reduce the opportunities for crime, that the crime isn't simply displaced elsewhere, the crime becomes extinct, if you will, because that patch is no longer able to provide the resources and opportunity structure for the foraging criminal. So I think I said everything I wanted to say. What do we know? So this also fits very well with this notion of repeat victimization and the near repeat phenomenon. There's a lot of work has been done out of London by Shane Johnson and Kate Bowers and Ken Pease. And we know, empirically demonstrated, that if a house is burgled today, there's a greater likelihood that it's going to be burgled either tomorrow, or the neighbors are going to be burgled tomorrow, or in some finite time period. That the risk is going to be heightened. And then that risk is going to decay over time back to some underlying baseline for victimization. Why is that? Why if a property is hit today, is it likely to be hit tomorrow? Well, the same individual may come back because he or she didn't get everything that they wanted the first time. The same individual it's basically a success, and it reinforces. If I can do it once in this house, let's wait until they get the new television that I stole, because everyone's going to replace their television. And I know how to get in, and I know how to get out. I know the behaviors of the guardians of that and that property, and I can, based upon their predictive behavior, I can go in. I know when is a good time to go in. I may tell my friend, "Oh, I just had this this great success at this local property." They may go back and try to build on my success. And so again, if it's not me, it may be somebody else in my network. The information about particularly attractive targets may disseminate through my social network, and now more criminals potentially know about a particular house or a particular block. And of course, there's things about the built environment that may make them attractive targets as well. But it's this self-excitation which is underlying the model for prediction. It's a Hawk's process model that has this self-excitation element to it. That we all have this, every spot in the geography has some underlying baseline, and with some probability, if that place is the site of a crime, in some finite time window, the probability, well, it may stay the same, it may go up a little bit, or it may jump way up. And it's being able to pick out those instances by looking over 3 years of data, tens of thousands of data points in a geographic region, thousands anyway, being able to pick out where it seems to be the case that there's real self-excitation versus just random noise in the model that is leading to the predictions of how to police these areas. So, I'm incredibly excited about what the Los Angeles Police Department is permitting us to do. There's lots of different ways one could evaluate predictive policing, and the true gold standard being randomization, and in this case we have randomization. The algorithm, when the crime analyst produces the daily forecast for crime, if you will, a map that has 20 500 by 500 boxes. Do we have that coming up?
Yeah, it's right after this.
Okay, right after this one, right?
That was the old way.
So this is what the officers receive. Go ahead. Do you want?
Yeah, I'll tell you, because this was just showing. We're trying to show here the size of the division, and I'll show you. Let me show you the last one. So this is how we used to do. Remember, I said that we used to send out missions like this, where we would see what was going on, and then put a polygon around it. And tell officers to be in there. See how large that is? The new boxes are about the size of this icon. All right, so if you go to that next map, see how small it is? This is all Foothill, and that's one box. So it's very.
And you'll get 20 of them.
That's the tool, and then this is the map. That's the map they get.
Okay. So
Could you tell us what distances actually?
yeah. Can you tell us what's the distance? Is it 2 miles across and about a mile more south?
The whole area.
That area is 50 square miles.
Oh,
So,
okay.
how big is the box?
500 by 500 feet. Yeah. So, any cartographers or folks that do GIS? Yeah. I teach GIS and have for about a dozen years, and I would shoot one of my students if they produced a map like this for anyone. There's way too much information that the human eye. I mean, really, robbery, PMs, you can't discern any true patterns on that in a meaningful way. What it does do is it gives somebody like Sean great confidence that they are conveying all of the important information with these, the text boxes and
Yes, what we found is it got more and more cluttered over time. It used to just be the polygons, and then people wanted more info, and so that's what it used to be, and then we've changed it now to the forecast map.
So anyway, sorry for jumping ahead, but the idea here is that the crime analyst in the morning goes to the machine, asks for the daily prediction, and may or may not get it based upon a random number generator sequence. The computer may say, sorry, that forecast is not available today, in which case she must replicate a map with 500 by 500 boxes, and we've come up with a very easy way for her to create that map. And they're not, not just randomly placed, but again,
and she places them like we used to. So
like we
there's
used
a
to,
cluster,
right? So,
and that gets approved by the CEO, and there's discussion over it.
right. Versus the other day when the computer will actually generate the crime forecast and everything is spit out automatically. So the idea is to determine whether or not this works, and I think we have to define what does it mean that predictive policing works. One, we want to know whether or not we can predict where crime occurs. Number two, we want to know whether or not by using this method we can realize a decrease in the number of crimes. And three, the real challenge is how do we measure that a significant change there. So again, we are going through this randomization, Foothill serving both the control and the treatment area. Now, Sean had alluded to earlier this notion that we don't want contamination because of all the different factors that might increase crime. In the predictive policing algorithm, I think the only thing that I truly would be really concerned about is implementation. It's not that the environment may be significantly different from the treatment and the control area. Because this is one of the other areas that I think is very important. Sean talked a little bit about, we all have our own biases, that if I hand you a map of the city of Los Angeles, or Sean handed me a map, not being a sworn personnel, but being a social scientist and having studied something about the causes and correlates of crime, and said, where should I allocate resources? I would have a good idea of which divisions, based upon the socioeconomic characteristics of that area, on where to place the resources. And even within bad neighborhoods, there's good areas. Even within good neighborhoods, there tend to be some less desirable areas. So I think we would always be biased in this. There's no race, there's no ethnicity, there's no income, there's no housing density, there's none of this entered into the model in an explicit way. It's based, again, the model's based upon human behavior, environmental, what we know about human behavior in terms of it being, us being creatures of habit. And so, I wouldn't be worried that you would have two uncomparable areas because of the amount of crime. That we can all control for statistically. So we have the daily mission, and we're running this for a number of months. Sean has already shown that this is what the old mission map looked like. And now, Sean, I do believe you still give something similar to this in addition to?
Well, we just give you a 7-day look at, so all of that is taken off except for the dots on the map. So they still, for officer safety reasons, we still have violent crime that's happening, so we want them to see where that's happened. And so, and we also assign violent crime missions. So there are 2 maps as needed. If we have a violent crime problem that comes up, we'll address that separately.
And I apologize if we haven't made this clear, but there's 3
separately.
There's 3 crimes going into the algorithm. This is not all crimes. This is a property crime model. Sorry, we should have probably made that clear. This is burglary, a theft from motor vehicle, and auto theft. Right? Correct. Okay. Those are the 3 crime types that we are doing the predictive policing, running through the algorithm to get the predictions. Yes, sir.
Why those 3 crimes? Why?
Density of crime at this point, the frequency of crime. It represents 75% of all crime in the city. It's a crime that we think the police also have the biggest ability to eliminate through their presence in the area by increasing the guardianship, if you will, within the routine activities of the motivated offender, the suitable target, and the guardianship. Really, what the predictive policing we want to do is increase the guardianship in that particular area to reduce crime and control crime. We have run the algorithms in different types of neighborhoods across different types of crime, including assaults, shots fired, and burglary. The patterns the predictions are reasonably comparable across all of those. But at this point, for the design to measure, to have enough crime to measure impact, we've decided for the experiment to focus in on these 3 crimes. Oh. Right?
There we are.
Oh.
That's good there.
Okay. So again, this is the all Foothill, and overlaid would be 500 by 500 feet grids. Go ahead to the next one.
Yeah, we're having a technical problem. Is that still plugged in? Is there a little?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, that's the tool.
Okay, so this is what the data actually needed includes, which is an x coordinate, a y coordinate, and a time. It's 3 years retrospective, and every morning the crime analyst takes a download from crimes up until that morning and feeds those into the machine, so it's constantly updating the algorithm every morning. And then we are given, the software will generate 20 500 by 500 boxes. Each one is labeled P1, PE, and so forth. And this is for the policing inside the box. We want to be able to measure the dosage effect, how much, it doesn't do us any good if we predict these very small geographic areas if no one ever patrols them. So we'd like to know how much time is being spent inside the box. What is the,
The dosage, you mean police time?
Police time in the box. And is it Christopher Cooper that has the, yes, Christopher Cooper, right? That is, what's that?
The Cooper curve.
The Cooper curve, right, of how much time one needs to police a particular geographic area and to realize a meaningful reduction of crime, right? So we want to sort of do this sort of, we want to be able to do this as well.
Those are close-ups. So that's what the officers get as well.
Right, of each one of these areas. Oh, so as a patrol officer right now goes in, they give a particular radio call. Code P1 means I'm inside that box, and then we're able to log the amount of time that they stay in there. We're not sure. I think there'll be a little bit of measurement error, but this is for us to worry about down the line. What else did I want to say about the boxes?
You're measuring in hours, is that right? Or
Minutes. Minutes. What we have found so far is there's a lot of variation about the amount of time spent in any of these boxes. The other thing, again, in the spirit of forensic refinement, the officers are not handed these maps and told to go park their cars for the rest of the day inside. These aren't donut shops. These are just 500 by 500 foot. Sorry, Sean.
Yeah, that's funny.
So they're not told to go park their car in this. It's at the margins, right? Go do what you normally do. And when you're not answering a police car or a police call, okay, or not responding to some emergency, please make sure you spend a little bit of time in these particular very specific geographic areas in the division.
So how precisely are you targeting this in time? Do these change on a shift by shift, day by day basis?
Right now we're doing everything day by day, Monday through Friday, not Saturday or Sunday, because we don't have the crime analyst working on weekends. So the experiment is really a Monday through Friday experiment at this point.
And do you factor any special events in, like if you've got a big baseball game or a football game?
That is where the CO comes in, and the model in and of itself, absolutely not. Absolutely not. It looks at the last 3 years. It doesn't know that, you know, today is, what's that? Thanksgiving, or yeah, Cinco de Mayo, or...
The only way that we get that is in seasonality of the crime, you know, because it's 3 years of data, and we would hope that those same patterns are embedded. If there's a series of, you know, like school is coming back into session, we know that affects burglary, and so those we think are embedded in the data, and at least it seems that way. And then I think what George is saying is, if we know we've got something, like I've got a big park in the division and we have a big event there where people are going to be drinking or something, then obviously I know that's going to affect our mission, and life goes on as usual. So I'll assign officers to that thing, and when they're done with that, then they're free to go to the boxes. And you'll see an example when we go through some results here of where we have very little time in the box and very few checks, and we can explain why that is.
Are the residential addresses of known offenders in your model?
No.
No.
They're not. And what's the relative weights of the main variables that you mentioned?
There are no variables. The only variables are location and time.
Indeed.
Over 3 years.
So the
X, Y, and T.
you're not using repeats, or you're not using more specific variables than that?
No, the model itself, the algorithm will pick up the near repeat phenomenon and generate the predictions based upon observed repeat and near repeat phenomena.
What are you doing at time in relation? You said that's one of the questions.
Days.
When they're busy, sorry, just one second. When they're busy, you know, answering a call, then after that, could they please, you know, pass through a box or go to visit a box? But that's that's random in terms of when they'll be free to do that.
You know what? We talked a lot about that because the model can tell you the highest probability time window to be in there between like 1 and 3, for instance.
Okay.
And in Santa Cruz, they did an experiment and they gave that information to the officers. And this is when the optimal time. What they found is the officers, if they didn't hit it between 1 and 3, they never went there. And that's not what we want. We want them paying attention to the boxes. Right now it's every 24 hours. The new version that's going into North Hollywood, the next will be every 6 hours they'll get a new map. So it'll line up with the regular watches. So when you come in, your boxes, and we've been comparing them now. It's like an iPad app, the way we can look at one versus the other. And you see the variation. So we'll have that. And then we're working on a future version that will, in fact, be an iPad app where, based on where you are in the GPS in the iPad, will produce a map based on where you are at that time and show you where the boxes are. And even we'll build an electronic fence around the box, so you don't even have to look at it; just give you a tone when you drive into a box.
The only reason why I picked that up, and forgive me for interrupting, but other people in the room will know the work here that British burglars, as it were, very often want to see a body on the beat because they know where they are. And they say, oh, right, and when they've gone past, then you can go and knock on the house and say, you know, was George there? Oh, no, nobody's there. We can go and do the house because we've seen the body walk by. So it's not that that's just a deterrent. They're actually sometimes, it's not an incentive, but it's part of their MO.
It's part of their MO.
How much do you find, do you find that is it 25 boxes per
20.
Do you find that they vary much from day to day, Monday to Friday, or do they tend to stay in the same 20 places?
They do vary and day to day.
And again, forensic refinement, making improvements at the margins. The other really important thing that we believe for this to have any real traction in the real world in a policing agency if these boxes don't overlap with the gut feeling, the heuristics, the officer's existing knowledge, if these are so counterintuitive, the predictions, no matter how good they are, the police aren't going to use them, right? And in fact, there's a lot of overlap between, if we were to ask Sean, draw the 20 boxes yourself, there's reasonable overlap. I don't want to say a lot of.
You can see it in the results?
Yeah, you precisely can't see it in the results. So, we're still a couple of months from having enough data to do a formal statistical analysis with enough power to talk about whether or not any results are statistically significant. But that certainly won't stop us from saying that things are clearly coming into the right direction. So,
You want me to hit some of those?
well, I think,
We covered a lot.
yeah, I think we really did. So preliminary results. And remember, at the margins, maintaining, I think, is going to become really important. So we're not seeing 50% reductions in crime. What we're seeing are 8 to 16% increases in our ability to predict crime. So if one were to take the boxes as drawn by the algorithm versus boxes drawn through the heuristic or the standard operating procedure, what we find is that we're better able to predict where crimes will occur. Now this becomes a little bit counterintuitive in the sense that we want to, on the one hand, it's important that we demonstrate that the algorithm is able to predict. From the policing standpoint, we would like no crime in the boxes and say, oh my God, we can't predict anything because we want from the effectiveness of using this to be such that Sean and the LAPD are able to dissuade all crime in these boxes by focusing their resources there. But at the end of the day, I'm sorry, so so that, yeah, so we're seeing somewhere around 10 to 12%, 8 to 16% more accurate in our ability to predict. And this is resulting in, this is just simply looking at our ability to predict. This is a longer series of data, 150 by 150 meter patrol cells that not based upon this time frame, but showing also that 20 is about where you get the maximum. And so 20 is not a random number in terms of the number of prediction or number of boxes being predicted. 20 is what they can do, and 20 is also where you get basically the maximum difference between the random patrol, the standard operating heuristic, if you will, and the prediction.
Yeah, so green is hotspots policing, basically. They have it as CompStat, and then blue is the model that we're using now. So you see there's a little incremental difference there.
One of the big criticisms of hotspot analysis is it typically shows you high population density areas. How does this model help you move away from that? So how do you ensure that all the boxes don't just end up in your town centres and your high population density areas?
So I think they still will. I mean, if it's embedded in the crime data, right, George?
Yes and no. It's not. There aren't going to be. It's forced to find 20 patterns in the data. Okay, that it feels are the most likely to have crime in that period. there's a lot of predictions of, in a very small geographic area for a particular day. These predictions are maybe we predict there's going to be 2 crimes, maybe there's going to be 3 crimes. It's the probability of any crime is, in terms of its magnitude, very, very small. In terms of the magnitude difference between random chance and predicted chance is very, very large. So maybe there's a 0.0002% chance of a crime in any 200 in a box, versus in a predicted there's a 0.2% chance or a 2% chance of crime. So it's clearly not deterministic. And this is also where the model, I think, has a little bit of a leg up on the typical algorithms being used in hotspot, is that it does tend to, even when you have a persistent hotspot, it won't be right on top of where you would expect looking retrospectively. There tends to be, offset by a few hundred feet to the left, to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west, based upon the historical patterns.
George,
yes.
One thing I didn't press either to do, but it would be quite, I think, helpful. Just tell us a little about Foothill, because how is it all residential? Is there a bit of a downtown?
Yeah.
Is there a bus station?
Go ahead. Yeah, you know it not much better.
So Foothill Division is in the San Fernando Valley. It's north of North Hollywood. So right nestled against the foothills there. It's 50 square miles. It's a lot of working class families living there. There's also a lot of light industry in there, and there's a rail going through there with lumber yards and a lot of wreckage, auto wreckage yards and things like that that are readily deal in stolen property and things. So it's a mix of heavily Hispanic, probably 85% Hispanic, small black population up in the Lakeview Terrace area, and a mix of low to middle income residents, and then a lot of high density housing as well. But there's pockets. There's a big Sun Valley is kind of a violent area to the south of the division, and then this large swath of area up here is go back there. Yeah, I can show it on that. See up above over here, Sunland. That's a totally different area. There's a different population up there. There's a lot of biker and white supremacist activity up there, not as much Hispanic population. Down here is a large Hispanic gang population in here, and mostly residential and high density housing. And then up in Pacoima, there's a lot of light industrial and still some high density and single family homes of lower, people who have divided these very small bungalow homes up into multiple family residences and things.
Sean, are you witnessing responsive behaviour by the criminals that are actually there at the moment? And one of the things that's come through from some of the studies about CCTV in the context of the UK is that, okay, you put them into city centres, then you get antisocial behaviour and criminal activity actually dispersing as a consequence of that. I mean, I know it's pretty early in.
No, I think it's early in, but there's anecdotal data. You talk to, in fact, there was a piece in the Independent recently that I read. They were out with one of my sergeants, and he had an example. He said, look, I'm at the park with you, we're in the box. Here comes gangster on his bike with his pit bull. He sees us here, he doesn't want to be here anymore. So he goes back to mommy or whatever he's going, and now he's not here to commit a crime. And that's the kind of thing we're seeing. They make themselves scarce when they see the police activity.
He's not displacement, he's not going somewhere else. He's going home.
He's going somewhere.
Yeah, but can we track?
Can we track where he's going?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I mean, that's not...
Okay, I'm just...
displacement. All the hotspots moving.
Yeah.
Too early to tell. I couldn't say. I think that's something that at the end of 6 months or a year we can go back and say, how did this year compare? As we can move those hotspots around day to day and see how they moved versus the year before, and we'll be able to pick up some things that way.
They actually might ask the offenders when you do arrest them.
We could, yeah.
If they're aware of it.
Right.
done some media interviews, and the other common question is, well, if you're able to predict where the crimes are going to occur, can't the criminals get a hold of this technology, know where you're predicting they're going to do the crimes, and then do them elsewhere? Geez, that's given a lot of credit to the typical auto.
Yeah. Both of them, a lot of them are meth addicts, and they would get halfway through that process.
Halfway through deriving the Hawk's process.
I think couldn't do the whole thing.
No.
Sorry, last question from me, honestly. I want to understand your policing model behind it. Are the resources that you're deploying into these areas, are they responsible for the response policing and the like, as well as the local policing?
Yeah, they have the officers, these are our regular patrol officers, and the model that we have in Foothill, and it may differ in other divisions as we roll it out. The model in Foothill is the boxes, or the mission for the day is everybody's business. Everybody who's working that day needs to address the mission at some point. And that's why on that other mission map, you'll see they have a little recap area where they're supposed to recap what they did in the mission areas. So it really is everybody's business. They could be answering 16 radio calls, they get a minute, they go in the box. So they have to be kind of strategic about planning it.
So you're looking at the response times for responding to 911 calls related to those things as well, because I guess if you're saying, look, if we weight ourselves towards these locations, then we should be able to produce our response to these response times.
We should, and we'll look at it at the end. I think we haven't been looking at it as we're going along, because I don't know that there would be any measurable difference, because the officers are doing this type of thing already. They know during their available time, they call it, in between calls, that they are to do extra patrol or proactive policing. And they used to have mission areas to do it. They were just a little bigger and more based on gut instinct. Now they're in a much tighter geographic area. So it's very similar to what they were doing already.
I think this will become very difficult to ascertain until we can do the GPS monitoring and actually know where people are and when.
When you use the word mission, do you mean the box, or do you mean the whole? Do you mean the box?
Yeah, the box are the mission areas.
This rests on two premises. One, that people report crime.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming that.
Yeah.
And the second is that the officers report the crime.
Mm-hmm.
Is this seen in a greater motivation of officers to actually report a crime and not cuff it?
You know what, I have not seen that, although I don't know that the officers are looking for an arrest. That's really what they're looking for. And so you kind of have to retrain them on the fact that, because we used to, and we still do to some extent, measure things based on arrest. Like an officer's not productive unless they're making arrests, so they want it. And I have to tell them, that's not what this is about. And they look at you like you're crazy. And they don't want to take a report, though, I know that. They will kiss a report off if you give them any opportunity. So you have to, I have not seen an increase in reports based on this. I think they're getting in there and they're pretty much doing what we ask them to do. High visibility, maybe talking to people about hardening a target and just kind of making their presence known.
But in terms of your predictive power, which totally rests on citizen behavior,
Yeah.
and the recording of crime.
Right.
You would think that one of the things that you would like to do would be to work with those two to increase your predictive power.
I mean, and have more reported crime?
Correct.
So encourage people to report?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, we don't seem very effective in getting that done. I mean, the reasons why people are not reporting a lot of times are, you know, they feel some threat to themselves or...
I understand that, but it seems to me that there is an off-camera bit that needs to be addressed as well.
In terms of the evaluation and the effectiveness of the strategy, however, I can't think of any reason why predictive policing would change either the officers or the reporting behavior. So while it would be wonderful to get more crime report, you know, reduce the shadowy figure of crime and get the true count of crime, I don't think there's been any fundamental shift.
So that's not what I said. I said you would increase your predictive power.
You don't think though? There may be an instance where a crime's committed, an officer is there in close proximity to that crime being committed, and it gets reported, whereas somebody might have blown off reporting, but the police are here, I'm going to report it. We may have some of that happen. Don't tell the chief that though, because that's going to increase the numbers.
I think it might help if you
Yeah.
knew something about the historical background you're playing into here, because those with a long memory, you're pushing against an open door. In fact, the first predictive software was produced in the UK in 1994 and sold as, eventually to a commercial company, ABM, which still marketed as Prophecy. It was trialled in the mid-90s in the West Midlands and later in Strathclyde. And of course at that time there was no GPS checking, getting the locations right, and the lousy quality of the background data really ensured that the Home Office, British Home Office, wouldn't support that development because it was unreliable. So eventually this software was sold to NYPD, to Philadelphia and West Australia. So there's been a lot of playing with these kind of ideas. When I came today, I really hoped that the model was going to be much more sophisticated, and that's why I asked my question about whether you included variables like ones that might be derived from P's or much more powerfully from Weisberg, who's shown that it's highly predictive if you look at whether an area is improving or getting worse in terms of its crime patterns.
Right.
But you know, I think we know quite well why it didn't take off in this country in the 90s. And there was then a lot of criticism of hotspotting. So a lot of the questions here are sort of secondary to having actually tried this, not with randomized controlled trials, I would say, but having tried it before and being enormously excited, certainly in the West Midlands, at the sort of results that were observed. And they very much
But with that data, but it was poor data, is that?
Yeah, I mean, for example, it was common practice to put all serious motor accidents, this is just an example, at the junction where the officers attending the accident left the motorway. And it took a lot of work down at the Centre for Spatial Geography here in London to demonstrate that, you know, all of that data is completely useless. But there's similar problems.
No, we feel very confident in our data. I mean, we do. We spend a lot of time with our crime analysts coding it, and there's a million codes. And I think we're very comfortable, especially since Chief Bratton's time, that our data is very good now. We would not have the ability to do this in the past.
Okay, that was all leading up to one thing, which is the most predictive helpful thing in our trials was when we amalgamated different time periods and visualized the change over time in little cartoons. So you could actually see the predominant crimes moving around a city space. Everybody who used that and saw it at the time, and I think it's still there in Prophecy actually, thought this was great. Now I noticed that your time coding not only doesn't grade up within a color, so you can't use a sort of static visualization, but you didn't mention any time visualization. So that's where
we don't use the density mapping for this purpose because we want them in a very specific area, not graded. Although we do that kind of animated GIF version of how our crime hotspots moving around using retrospective data, and I think eventually we can do it here, show where we predict over time crime moving to. But for it to be really actionable, we felt like we need to get them in that very small geographic space.
I mean, the other thing that we didn't have ComStat to reinforce it. So it was do it if you want. You know, if you're really taken by this technology, you've got to have a go.
But the interesting thing is, I was the patrol commanding officer in Foothill then, and now I'm the commanding officer of ComStat and our crime center. So we will be able to drive it, you know, from ComStat.
Can I just take this moment to ask George, do you have things that you want to add before we stop? When we come back, we'll pick up on it.
We can come back and use the results.
I'm not sure that this is just a fine place to stop.
It is.
Or is there too much slides and we're done?
Yeah,
do the 2 slides.
Okay, so go ahead. Sean put this together for
this is the first 5 weeks that we were doing. Just kind of give you an idea. It's persistent. But, so this red line is the 2010 average of these 3 crimes: burglary, burglary for motor vehicle, and GTA. So in 2010, per week in Foothill, we were averaging about 60 of those crimes. This is a strict time series. It has nothing to do with the control versus treatment days that we're going to do at the end of 6 months. But I want to see, so I can give the officers some feedback. So, and then this is the same week, like the week of November 6th for 2010 and the week of November 6th. So it's very simple to look at the difference, right? And then I also took the weekly average for 2011 for those crimes leading up to the test. And so what we're seeing is, versus that 50, we're still averaging in 42. And this might be up to about 45 now that we're 10 weeks into it. But still, after, you know, we would have expected to maintain around 50 in that general vicinity, and we're seeing a few more. And then when we did the more sophisticated analysis through UCLA, we were seeing a difference of about 4 or 5 crimes a week. And I tell, you know, I'm in the back of the room, accounts that, and people say, I need that tool. How are you doing? I mean, are you getting reduction? I say, yeah, we're seeing maybe 4 or 5 crimes a week that we wouldn't normally see. And they're like, 4 or 5 crimes? What's the big deal? But when you're looking at 50, and it's 10%, and our goal for next year is, again, across the board, 5% reduction. So if we can get you 8 or 10% on these crimes that make up the bulk of your crime problem, I think that's going to help you through the year. And it's just that incremental, I'm going to steal it from you, Nick, again, the shaving of additional points of crime off there. So that's one slide, and yeah.
Sure, I'm just wondering whether there are any things that your gut tells you should be input into this model that will help you a little better. I mean, all I noticed were your traditional sort of crime policing data analysis cycle, which didn't seem to be reflected in this test study. You include things like weather data. Now, what typically happens, certainly in London, hot summer nights, people leave the windows open, you tend to get a little more burglaries. I presume that would help.
So we've talked a lot about what factors to include and what not. And when we were developing this algorithm, they would run the crime data only, and they'd add weather. And they'd run this, and they'd add other factors. And the most accurate in terms of predicting is when we just ran the crime alone. So we kept coming back to it, saying it was, it was inconsistent with the findings when we added this 4th or 5th element. And so what I really think is happening is that weather and seasonality and those other things are embedded in the crime. And if you put them in again, it gets double represented, So the fact that it's hot in the summer, we're going to see that crime coming up every summer and then come back down. So if I add it in again, it complicates it, I think. I mean, I'm not a mathematician, believe me.
It's about having the most parsimonious model we possibly can, and keeping things as simple while still maintaining the integrity of the prediction. I'm a social scientist by training. I believe that there are lots and lots of important psychological, sociological elements that we need to understand that we need to explore to truly understand, why crime happens in a particular area and who commits crime, the importance of the built environment. But just as Thomas Schelling was able to take a very simple idea, a very complex idea, that of segregation, and reduce it to a very simple choice and demonstrate that when you take out all of these other social, psychological explanations of why we end up with segregated residential housing, and instead say, well, we prefer to live, we don't mind living with other groups as long as there's 1 or 2 or whatever that's similar to me, that it produces segregated societies. And there's something very powerful when you can explain very complex phenomenon with a parsimonious model like this.
I like parsimonious models too, if you can validate them. The 500 by 500 block, I wanted to understand why you were liking on that. Partly the size. I mean, I can understand when you're capturing data, it's convenient to have a rectilinear grid. But on the ground, that may cut through an apartment complex and not make kind of practical sense. How did you get to that?
You're absolutely correct. In some ways, it makes no practical sense. If we go back, you can see that it's lopping off street corners. So it's would make sense if the drawing followed the boundaries of streets and housing lots at the very
But you know
least.
what it does? It forced the officer to get out of the car because the officers are in such a tight spot in an intersection. And you know, I'm not going to tell them exactly what to do. I say, get in there, get in the box, get out of the car, and you can get out and walk around and see in that space what needs to be addressed. And we actually, going into this, we had 500 by 500 foot boxes that they were using in Santa Cruz, and I said, you know, that's awfully small for a division my size. Can we go to 1,000 by 1,000 or something? And they ran the model, and it was not as efficient in terms of the predictions at that larger size. So they decided to go down to 500, and actually, it's been actionable. I mean, we can get people in that space.
I'm going to use my discretion here to pause and to give everyone a chance to get their sandwich or together. We've got a couple of slides which will resume.
Yeah, and I don't even know that we need, that's just the usage.
Okay, well, if we don't have it, there are ways. And just one last thing. Next time, I should have done, because we hadn't really started the questions, please introduce yourself. So tell us who you are and where you're from, if possible. That would be helpful for our speakers. Okay, we'll be back in 10 minutes.
Ladies and gents, Nick Argan, Chief Exec at the MPIA. I've been asked by Blair just to share a few thoughts by way of reflection on what we've heard, as well as a very brief thumbnail sketch of some of the interesting things that are going on in the UK at the minute of a parallel nature. My first reflection, and I don't think that reflected in some of the questions that came from the floor in the course of the presentation, is this feels like a moment of reawakening rather than a moment of revelation. And the work has struck a chord among many in the room and takes us back to a journey that we have collectively been on since I guess the 1980s in policing. Although somebody showed me a PowerPoint presentation the other day when somebody with a rather longer memory traced this all back to Adriano Balbi and André Michel Guéry in 1829 in France, although the predictive element of their metropolitan crime map was not its strongest point. Sean's absolutely right to say that what we're doing here, and these numbers he talks about, we've been talking and agreeing violently this morning as we followed each other around Radio 4, Channel 4 News, that this is harder and harder as you build on more and more success. And what we have each done is, on either side of the Atlantic, we've had considerable success in reducing crime, and you then find that you're really just shaving off at the margins, and actually tiny percentage point reductions are really impactful. I've enjoyed the presentation very much indeed, although the bit that made me feel most uncomfortable and the bit that I would have wanted to stand up and disagree with was your slight hostility to arrest. And whilst call me old-fashioned if you will, but I just do think there's something rather good about the reassuring clunk at the cell door.
You're old-fashioned.
The intelligence opportunity that presents, and I think this takes its place alongside, of course, prevention and preventive patrol and target hardening and all of those things too. But please let's not be encouraging British officers not to arrest burglars. That would be the start of a very slippery slope. But we certainly do need a plan about what we do when we've identified the geographic box. Yes, patrol is part of it, but there's some really encouraging work going on around the country to plot the precise nature of the response, and that's the super cocooning that you hear about in Manchester and partnership approaches up and down the country. Because after all, this isn't just about the police, and chatting briefly with Mike Alderson as we broke there, not only in terms of the data, that we shouldn't necessarily constrain ourselves to police data in the analysis, but neither should we constrain ourselves to a police-only response, because partners have their role to play too.
A general reflection is how encouraging it is to see on your side of the Atlantic the academic community and enforcement community working together, which reflects obviously a very long tradition in the UK. I think the third piece of that jigsaw is then the contribution of the commercial sector and the business community. And I don't know who's doing the design of this kit, but you've talked about the way that you've rejigged things and you've made things work and you've tinkered with the map. And I think really it's kind of making things happen in a technological way, that there's a big opportunity for the business community, well represented in this room, to step in and bring their know-how. The talk about apps and that type of approach seems to be evidently sensible. On your work, I mean, clearly early days, but I think some very encouraging signs based on some early work, but long research lying behind it, and it'll be really interesting to track that and see what comes next as you refine it and test it, refine it and test it. I imagine that the story will only get better. In the UK, we have some interesting work going on. We're partnered with the Urban Institute to look at 15 predictive crime mapping software packages that are available and try and produce an evaluation which we anticipate in the spring of this year. We'll be publishing it on our Polka online knowledge area for the police service, and to give a view about which of these software packages is the most accurate. We're also providing, in partnership with UCL, University College London, analytical support to West Yorkshire Police, and we're working with the people who deliver our UK crime map, the Citizen Access Online Crime Map, to see if we can take data that's now available in police stations and make it available on officers' mobile devices as they're out patrolling. So in this spirit of reawakening, it's good to develop a spirit of partnership. Sean and I have already had discussions this morning about the need to keep in touch, and certainly for as long as there is an NPIA, that's not all that long, of course, but for as long as there is an NPIA, we will be working, and we'll also be working to ensure that this type of thinking, this type of developmental forward-looking thinking becomes part of the professional body for policing that will come to be at the end of this calendar year, and we'll pass on the work that we're doing to that professional body for policing, encouraging that continued partnership with the academic community and the business community, and I hope keeping the ties with international partners, so continue to learn from each other. I plan to say really no more than that, Roger. I think much more important and interesting is the questions we're no doubt going to hear, both from our guests from the US, but also looking around the room, enormous expertise in the room, and I hope people won't be timid about chipping in.
Well, the only thing is I want you not to be timid either, having had that go that you chip in as well, okay? Is that a deal? Right. Okay, questions? Yes. Could you say who you are as well?
Yes, Michelle Allen from KPMG. Sean, I'm really interested in one of the things that you were saying about kind of not necessarily being able to measure, or trying to measure things like the amount of time officers are spending in the square and so on. Allude to kind of cultural issues around making sure that officers are doing the things that you're asking them to do, being able to measure where they are, using the discretion, problem solving whilst they're there. And I'm just wondering whether, and that's been our experience of working in data analytics on sort of the offender management side of things. I'm just wondering whether you've got any, or what your emphasis is on sort of trying to solve some of those kind of enabling factors and cultural factors alongside the technology.
Mm-hmm. So I'll tell you one thing that is is going to be somewhat of a wild card as we move from one division to the next, is the amount of buy-in that the CO is able to get. And we were joking a little bit about the fact that how did we pick Foothill? It wasn't through sophisticated analysis, it was because I was there and I could push that agenda. And I think that we're going to have to get out there and do some training of COs on how to, we're not used to convincing the officers of the value of things, we're used to ordering them to do it, And in this case, because you don't have a lot of, there's not a lot of checks and balances, and there will be with the GPS, but they can get around that too, they're smart, If they don't want to be there, they're going to tell you they were there whether they were or not. So I think a lot of it has to do with buy-in. And it's got to change the management philosophy in some of these divisions where we encourage people to be creative and we tell them they have a responsibility for fewer victims, and we're going to help you achieve that, but you need to get in this box and you need to do what you know, use your knowledge, skills, and experience to make it happen. And then put the responsibility on them as professionals. And really the tracking via GPS is just to kind of for our data analysis to see, it's almost like a blood test after you've given someone prescription medication and see how much is in their system, you know. That's kind of what we're using the dosage for.
There is an issue which is an interesting one that you've raised, and also you know, rather jokingly said, we don't want to give up arrests.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing that arrests provide is a narrative, a very clear statement about what they did. They went from A to B and did C, and you know, so that process is very clear. It seems to me there's a cultural problem in what there always has been in crime prevention, is how do you brag about it back in the canteen.
I think you can't be mutually exclusive. You know, I emphasize the place-based nature of this, but there's a whole other intelligence-led policing thing that we work on separate from this, where we're looking at impact players, the guys who are hitting us the hardest, and concentrating on them, most of them being on parole, and doing parole searches on them, and then bringing them in and debriefing them, and we have a whole separate investigative analysis that's going on with them. But I like to keep it separate from predictive policing because people in the civil rights community especially are afraid of the term predictive policing, so I need to draw a stark line between that and the other.
So they can still get a buzz by lifting it.
I'm all for arresting someone.
Okay. Yes.
Sorry, Oliver Wells, just part of the community policing panel in South East London. I'm just wondering whether, just following your second point, some of the other methodologies that you guys are looking at, possibly one for yourself and George, whether things like social network analysis are being used, you know, who are the, sort of, you know, again, prime movers in this, whether there's a power or distribution to actually, the bad guys who do an overall number of high-level crimes, if you like, as opposed to a long-term guys who are doing fairly level.
You know, George's done a lot on social network analysis of gangs, and we have some recent work that he did. I think it'd be better if you
respond.
Yeah, in fact, that was the seminar I gave across the street yesterday for the Defense Geospatial Intelligence Group, which was my original reason for coming over. But we actually, one of the first areas that we had some success with using this Hawks process modeling was in looking at the structure of gang violence in a different community in Los Angeles, precisely because I do have information on the rivalry network, which groups are rivals with which groups, and the 2 or 3 years of several thousand incidents that involved a gang member, whether it was shooting at one another, killing one another, or some violent crime. And so we have been thinking about how to take that model and introduce it into the realm of policing as well. But because it's a group-based model, it has some complications. It's not a 500-meter by 500-foot box.
Are you finding that specific to LA? Are there cultural aspects in terms of how gangs work with each other there? Is it across America? Like here?
It's at least across America. I'm not an expert on gangs on the international scene. So what you call a gang over here may be very different from what I'm familiar with in the United States. But again, it's built upon the notion that there's a structure of retaliation. There's a set of relationships that link groups together. In Los Angeles or anywhere that I'm familiar with, it really doesn't make any sense to identify as being a member of a gang unless you have an enemy. Your whole identity is against some enmity, is defined by having some enmity relationships. And so you have that as part of the structure. There's a geographic component to the gangs in Los Angeles and many US cities where they claim a very specific area. And then you have what is presumed a retaliatory nature of gang violence. And what we were, again, using the same general notion of self-excitation through this Hawks process model, you could take a n-by-n grid of gangs and basically predict both the intensity and the duration of a gang war between any of those pairs once they started. What we found is that some of the groups, if they had a shooting today and then there was a retaliatory shooting in some short amount of period, that tended to be it. Whereas other gangs, once it started, it was going to last for a while. So the question becomes again, how does one allocate policing resources to have the largest impact across the universe of gang violence? But again, I'm lamenting the fact that even gangs don't commit enough crimes these days, and I'm really suffering from a paucity of data in Los Angeles, and trying to, I'm one of the few people that are, wishing for more crimes.
Because they kill each other.
Yeah, I know. I'm sure it's because.
Well, you're welcome. Let me say that first. You're welcome.
I was expecting you to say thank you. I'm just convinced. Crime is. I've only been in Los Angeles since '97, '98, and since I got there, crime's just gone down and down and down. I'm pretty sure it's my project.
Can I add something to that on the gang stuff from the UK? Simon Cottingham from Esri. The Scottish Violence Reduction Unit did some really interesting predictive analytics on, instead of boxes, they were looking at routes and looking at the where gangs were located and how they were travelling into the city centre. So what they did was predict what bus routes they'd be using, and then did targeted work on those bus routes to do stop and search, take weapons off of the potential gang members, and they actually saw a significant reduction in violent crime in the city centre.
We had a police officer from Scotland yesterday describing exactly this in the talk across the street.
Okay, sorry, Nick, you want to respond?
Yeah, just I think the raising of social network analysis just put me in mind of an interview, a press interview on this subject earlier today, and there's a reporter saying, look, Trafford in Manchester has employed these tactics, they've seen the burglary drop by a quarter, why doesn't everybody roll it out tomorrow? And it's a very simplistic view of the world, and actually what really happens is things like social network analysis combined with these predictive tactics, combined with effective neighbourhood policing, effective offender management, effective partnership working, and actually the totality of that partnership effort is what delivers you sustained crime reduction. And really, we need to just keep our eye on this, that it is another effective tool in an increasingly effective toolkit. The second point, the frustration in the light of that, thought, is just how much of this is elective, and how there is just a tradition in policing that police commanders are kind of free to take good tactics or leave them, and not quite like that one. That's a tough nut to crack, but I think it's a kind of long-term problem that we should be intolerant of.
But maybe you achieve what's
Sorry, Barry, can you introduce yourself?
Barry around Europe for the Peace Foundation. What you're suggesting, that there's a sort of continuous process of innovation and renaming. You're saying there's something is added, value is added by a number of things. And what if you look at the last 10, 15 years, you'll find the renaming of all kinds of strategies. And in fact, it can be elective because a good smart cop is going to buy into whatever's new and whatever is fashionable. So this constant rediscovering of a range of strategies might be in itself a way of making sure that what we want them to do is actually elected for.
Well, I think rediscovery is rediscovery, and that's one thing. Renaming is renaming, and that's quite another. And I just was reflecting as we went through the presentation today, how long will it be before I hear the word dosage presented back to me from a different corner of British policing, we find new and flashy ways of not that happens, of course, but we do find new and flashy ways of describing tried and tested ideas. But quite distinct from that, I once saw a lecture in the Times which was quite critical of policing. It was from some very senior medics, and they were saying there's just something about the police service that doesn't properly build its evidence base and doesn't understand as well as it should what works, and isn't sufficiently effective in terms of trialling and randomised trials and getting very effective research around policing. And I know that colleagues at the MPIA had made great strides in that a long time before I ever got there, and they continue in difficult circumstances to continue to try and do that. But it goes against the grain of policing, and that really is my observation.
Yeah, which is what I meant by that is. Okay, more please. Yes, could you introduce yourself?
Ellie Rice from Innovation Work CBS. Just building on that point there around sort of research.
Actually, the people in the back will hear you.
Sorry. Just looking at the question there of research in the UK and how you kind of build that relationship with police forces. Obviously, with the MPIA phasing out in the sort of near future, where do you see as sort of that touch point for research institutes and academics looking at police-related problems? Certainly, in my experience over the last couple of years, having looked at police force or into industrial-based research, it's been actually quite a challenge to build up that relationship with police forces, because some of the points that Sean mentioned earlier, unless you have a sort of commanding officer who's very open to new technology or new ideas coming in, is kind of forward thinking, open to take something on and try it, it can actually be quite difficult even just to start a conversation, because obviously budget cuts, etc., police are focused on what works here and now and the resources they've got. So trying to open up that conversation to take something new or is really difficult, yet you can start to see real benefits coming through just by taking eyes on what your view is in terms of where research is going.
Just pause a second. Did everyone hear that in the back or not? You can repeat the question.
Okay, well, where basically this challenge of what comes next in protecting the police research community post MPIA. It's a discussion we had this morning at a Whitehall Industry Group event, and I think that there is sufficient determination in people like Sir Dennis O'Connor and the Inspectorate of Constabulary, some of the senior figures of the Home Office, to take that kernel that is the research analysis and information team at NPIA and find a home for it, probably in a reduced size, but nevertheless with a pretty healthy future going forward. There's sufficient determination to ensure that will happen. And precisely where it goes, we'll wait and see. There are politics around all the potential outcomes for it, but they, since their days as the Home Office Police Research Group, that they have grown and improved, and they're an absolute jewel in the crown of what we've got, and we would be stupid to do away with them. What will go, I think, individual forces will be scaling back their capacity to support this type of work, and we're going to be really dependent on the biggies here, the big players, and we may scale a few things down as we go through sort of lean times and fallow times, with a view to having to build back up later on. The quality of our partnerships with the academic sector will therefore become more important and they're good. And again, there are very few questions that I'm asked to which I don't have part of my answer as the business community, but I think that's true again here. And in particular, in terms of applied research, there's a really exciting proposal which is gathering some momentum with, it's led by Finmeccanica, the Italian company, who are looking to take the night works model that works in the military, where industry and the state come together to talk about problems and then toss the problem into the night works machine, and they'll come up with some sort of creative solutions to it. The idea is for blue light works, for policing, there will be a partnership that will kind of take some of the strain in the kind of applied research, technological research.
Yes, Betsy, please introduce yourself and then we'll make it.
Betsy Stainman from the Met Police, and as an academic, former academic, current academic, but inside the police for the last 9 years. I also think that it's taken a long time for police services to understand how to work with not only businesses, but academics as well. I am the single point of contact for research in the Metropolitan Police. You'd be surprised at how little people understand how to approach, what to approach, and the other thing is they come trying to sell wares as opposed to really understanding that the only way you're going to do this is to map it onto one of the worlds that the police live in at the moment, the language within which they can understand this world, and the practicalities that they might get out of something. So trying to sell something, which is in my experience, I get lots of people calling me up trying to sell me this package to do this and that package to do that. And we're not, because at this point, we're not going to buy. But collaboration is a different issue, and I think the world has changed. But it's very, very different to do research on the outside as an academic and on the inside as an academic. And it's something that that is a skill that people also need to understand and use as well.
David Page, I'm a retired police officer, so I can probably talk slightly more freely than some of my colleagues in the room. I'll cast a couple of things into the room to start with. One is, if you'd come 5 years ago with this, it would be snapped up. You'd come too late. I don't know how much this product costs, but I wouldn't buy it on the simple thing that you only look at 3 types of crime on 5 days a week. And that's unacceptable for trying to sell a product. I appreciate it's what you're aiming towards, a better refined product in Los Angeles and in part of LA, but it doesn't actually cross the Atlantic for me. I wouldn't buy it.
We're not selling.
But, well, there is a strange relationship between the British and the American policing communities.
And you know, we learn a lot from the British Police Service, and I think you'll find in many things we are 5 years behind.
Yeah.
So the timing's right on this, I think.
Yeah. I would argue in actual fact, in terms of community links and professionalism, you have been far in advance of us for the last 20 years. Particularly not at senior officer level, but at ground level, where the officers are far more professional than we were. I think the other one which you talk about is this idea of police officers going into boxes. And I think it's interesting you've got an anthropologist involved, but you're talking about discretionary time. That is a huge factor in large parts of the United States. I appreciate LA may not be, and certainly not Chicago. But police officers in this country, when they have discretionary time, are not on the street. They're inside the police station doing paperwork. And one of the things that worries me about some of what all 3 of you have said is you talk about academics, the police and the business community all knocking on the door of public finance and also calls for effectiveness. But what I would like to know is where are the victims and where are the public and local communities in this, because they are not even mentioned. And I'd be interested to see how this experiment in Foothills actually relates to the local community. I assume they are aware of it, but what has been their response to this idea of police?
Very helpful, thank you. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I'll try to through.
Bob Harris, I'm a freelance management consultant. I was interested in the model and the fact you focused on acquisitive crime and drawing on the sort of hunter-gatherer model, which seems to me makes a lot of sense. Clearly, some other crime types don't follow that kind of hand-of-the-cloth model, but might follow others. So, for example, it's pretty well known when you look at calls for service that Friday night, Saturday night tend to be peak periods. Surprise, surprise, in this country, the pubs throw people out, the nightclubs throwing people out who've drunk too much alcohol. So certainly some of the forces I've worked with look at where those incidents normally of violence occur. These aren't acquisitive crimes, but they relate to a predictable pattern of demand. So I guess my general question is, are you looking to model other classes of crime where there may be a different behaviour pattern to add again to the kind of gut feel that the local commander would have about policing the pubs and pubs?
Yeah, so this project began about 7-8 years ago under NFU, Google, University of California Mathematical and Simulation of Crime Modeling Project, or just Google Jeffrey Brantingham and go to his homepage. We've been looking and working on a variety of different models in terms of understanding crime formation patterns, from reaction diffusion models in physics to the Hawks process models to agent-based models. We've been looking for many years trying to understand the best we can about the generative processes of these observable crime patterns and how one might police them, how one might impact them. So the short answer is yes, there are lots of different types of crimes with lots of different types of models we're looking for. It's so important for us to demonstrate the efficacy of this predictive model before we try to go on something that is as simple as property crime before we try more complicated gang, assaultive, whatever behavior. So let's see if we're even there with the predictive policing in a statistical and in a meaningful way. And I would just like to say about the importance of the community. I think that's a really, really important point. And the concern that we often get, the fear that we must allay over and over again is this notion that this is targeting individuals and not geographic areas. But we've also gotten comments that, boy, it's nice to know that you're trying to protect us from crime, that this is a not after it happens approach to crime, and you're just going to come take a report after my home has been broken into, and that this can prevent crime in my neighborhood. And people have asked, can we go to white collar crime, and what if identity theft, and won't there be patterns that one could intervene on if somebody has stolen a credit card, where they're going to start using and taking advantage of the information that they've stolen. And slowly.
There is one question that comes out of what you were just saying there as well, and that is redlining. Whether this would be used to redline boxes. Everyone know what redlining is? The insurance companies just redline it, which they won't insure because of the high crime.
Or mortgage won't lend.
Mortgages won't lend it. So I just wondered whether this could be used, as it were, against those people in those boxes, predictively, as the redlining does.
Not any more than crime data already does. There's nothing, I would argue that maybe we could turn that around and say, oh, they know that there should be crime, and now they're going to prevent the crime there, so maybe we should drop the insurance rates. That's never going to happen.
Good. I mean, the hope is eventually, if we do a good job in that area, we'll have fewer victims in that area, and that box won't be, 6 months from now, you may not see it in there as often.
And that's the thing. I mean, the boxes change on a daily basis.
That's interesting. Journalists certainly always have a tendency to stereotype as well as police do, and so the neighbourhoods and so on become fixed. But it's very unsubtle, sort of gradation. We're running out of time. Now, does anybody want a last one or two more questions? I'll have yes. Sorry, you've actually had.
It's just a thank you to Sean. My sister lives in thank you for
okay, good. Yes, sir.
Me? Yeah. Captain Peelian, yes. I was just wondering if you could comment on the accuracy rates you get in your predictive algorithm, which I don't know if I've missed, looking at the slides and how they degrade as you try to predict further into the future.
I don't have that slide either. I'm thinking here, what can how to respond with some data.
That's it. I asked the question about how long, how far out can we go? And the answer I got back is let's deal with the immediate future. But eventually we would like to see how far out can we have an accurate forecast? And can we, by crime type eventually, by days into the future, do something? No, we can do it somewhat with radio calls, because we have a lot of data on that, but the reported crime, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, you would expect that just as meteorologists are going to update the weather forecast on a daily basis, and we're not completely comfortable making the weather forecast, crime forecast comparison, but you're throwing away data points by trying to go too far into the future. If we can get tomorrow with some accuracy, let's do the data. Let's input the data that we were of that day to go to the next day and so forth, moving on. Again, all we know. All I can say in terms of any kind of quantification is that we do 8 to 16% better than Sean's heuristic, his gut, his experience, which I feel much better. I think that's a good number. I wouldn't want to know that we're predicting so much better than Sean, because we might get him fired.
Oh, and the other thing is, even if it was even with what a human could do, that's pretty good, right? I mean, you get the computer to be even with somebody who's got 20 years doing it, and that's pretty good.
This is sad. I think I should add to that from a kind of UK perspective. Some of the sorry, I understand you're Bevan. I work at the National Policing Improvement Agency in the research team there. Some of the work that UCL have been doing in places like West Yorkshire, the interesting thing to look at is before you start your model, to look at the extent to which burglary clusters both in time and in geography. And if you can get a pretty good sense of how far apart that is, so in West Yorkshire, for example, burglaries are more likely to occur close to each other within kind of 50 metres and within 7 days of each other than you would expect by random chance. And that enables you to kind of calibrate your model to what you'd expect for the data in your particular area. And there's certainly different ranges of accuracy for the different models. Things in UCL they've been looking at, if you split your grid cells up into the kind of top 20% highest risk grid cells, you're covering about 75% of your crime. Whereas for the lower forecast accuracy models, some of the kind of more standard kernel density estimation models that some police forces are using at the moment, for that top 20% cells might only be forecasting about 40–50% of the burglary. So that's some of the order of difference you're going to get from forecast.
Thank you very much. Okay, sorry, we got one more. Okay.
Just a quick one.
You are?
Sorry, Goran Jalawani from MPI. Did you, when you were analysing your data, did you notice any cycles in your patterns? Because like criminals, like most people, are pretty, they are habitual. So they tend to commit a crime and then feed from it and then commit another, as and when they need to. So did you notice any cycles?
So there's no individual level information in the model whatsoever. So we don't know who committed these particular crimes. All we know that these particular crimes were reported.
Right.
But I mean, that's the strength of what you say is what allows us to even estimate the model, is the fact that there are predictable patterns, that people aren't creatures of habit, that I mean, the near repeats phenomenon is in and of itself a cyclical pattern. So clearly we're capturing those sorts of things, but not in terms of a particular offender. Is not what we're looking at in this study.
Okay, it's now 2 o'clock. I'm going to wind up. That everyone's happy with that. I find it very interesting, especially for the reasons I explained earlier,
I will just tell you, and I've been brought you a present of it. We did 3 films in Oxford where we studied Oxford for 2 weeks and looked at how much harm there was, not just how much crime. We looked at the arson figures, we looked at domestic violence, we looked at all sorts of other signs of harm and saw how little of that was reported to the police as a way of trying to understand the kind of general experience of the community. Nobody had done that before, and I'm happy to give this to you. But what was both touching and frustrating, and has been for me over the years, is that problem-oriented policing, which has to come out of this understanding of where these patterns are, doesn't have the narrative thrust that arrests do. And there's still, pushing a boulder up a hill on that one. Everybody signs up to it, but because it's not exciting, it does take a long time. You hand it over to other agencies and so on. It's really hard. And all I would say is that I love the data. I think it's really interesting. But if you can get buy-in for the longer-term journey of the implications of the data, you're doing really well. And that's the hardest part of this, I think. So anyway, will you join me in thanking our speakers?